Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you guys all for joining our virtual session here at our virtual conference for MENA's InfoSec 2020 conference. My name is Sanara Marsh, and I'm going to be taking you through a presentation today. The title of the presentation is Security is a Team Sport. I thought it was increasingly relevant given the current circumstances we find ourselves in, knowing that it's started to change our global workforce, and what are those implications on security. So a little bit about me. My name is Sanara Marsh. I am a security strategist as well as a senior technical marketing manager here at VMware Carbon Black. I typically, when I talk at conferences, I talk about enabling novice users solely from the perspective of knowing that there are a lot of opportunities that present themselves in the cyber industry, and a lot of times people, I feel like, are intimidated by cybersecurity because they feel like they have to be that unicorn cybersecurity professional that's in a hoodie, that's reverse engineering malware, and that's doing all of these different things. But there are plenty of opportunities for people to learn within the industry. And I really feel and truly feel that the attackers are collaborating together, so why shouldn't we? We need to have these conversations so that we can be better together. So today I'm taking you through three things in this in our agenda here. I'm going to start out with detailing something about our new normal. It's something that maybe you guys are currently talking about or you're going to start talking about just based on some of the landscape shifts we've seen in this last year. And then we're going to go into security training to date, only to contrast on, what are we doing today? How does it engage your employees? And what can we do to truly engage them while we are working from home and starting to introduce some of these other components? So without further ado, let's talk about 2020, right? It's been a hectic year, to say the least, but it's absolutely something that has started to change how we even need to think about cybersecurity. And one of the key things is looking at our threat landscape or our global workforce landscape to date, right? Previously, where we have had our employees in our offices, we have noticed a very drastic shift. Very large organizations are announcing that they are planning to work from home indefinitely. People like, or companies like REI, who had just recently built out new corporate headquarters, is announcing work from home indefinitely. Zillow, Twitter, Squarespace. Microsoft is even delaying opening until mid-2021 at this point. So this is starting to change what we know to be true, right? We know that people go into the office, they're protected behind the corporate firewall, but now we've got this distributed workforce, whether it's mandated by your government or it's something that is suggested by your employers. We are in the midst of a global pandemic, and it's starting to shift what we know to be true about our employees. And this can even extend into our security operations team, right? Where we traditionally had a centralized SOC, now our SOC members are maybe working from home, trying to solve the same problems that they were previously. Now, I'd like to throw in this tidbit here, just solely to compare it to the work from home environment that we're experiencing, right? If we are starting to promote working from home indefinitely, what does that mean for the majority of people or the large majority of people that are now working in the workforce? We have a large percentage of employees that are millennials. And it's interesting because work from home essentially points out that you have somewhere that you are staying, right? But with millennials are not homeowners, just by pure statistics here, what this could also introduce is people not working on a home network. Rather, maybe they're traveling and working remotely from random locations that they're not familiar with. It's something that they don't have, just a office that they're working from home. So we're just introducing new complexities to security where previously, whether you were in the office or you were in your home office because you knew you had to go back into the office at some point, we are introducing a lot of flexibility. And we are starting to see this distributed workforce be that new normal. What is this going to be in the next 5 years if we have companies that are saying we're going to work from home indefinitely? So we're starting to see some different challenges in terms of the threat landscape, and I tried to bucket some of these out just as conversational points. I wish we were in person so that we could have this conversation. But when we think about the remote workforce, there are definitely some challenges that have been compounded because of the global pandemic, right? We've got a staff shortage. Now, this is not to be isolated just to pandemic issues in terms of sick leave and planned leave. We obviously have a cybersecurity skills shortage, so most IT and security professionals or teams are understaffed and overworked. So this is already a problem even in the days of yesteryear. But now we've got this remote workforce. We've got people that we have to anticipate sick leave, right? This is a concern. We are in a pandemic. We've got planned leave, which is typical. But we are also seeing a decrease in overall productivity, and people are needing to check in on their overall mental hygiene. A lot of people are struggling with this new work from home nature. They're getting very isolated, and people are needing to take mental health days. But now again, where you were once understaffed, you've got a lot of other factors that you have to calculate in here. And attackers and adversaries don't rest, right? They're not going to take a break, so you can't give them an out because they're going to exploit that. We've seen that to be very true in the healthcare industry. Even during the pandemic, they are more highly targeted with special spear phishing campaigns or targeted spear phishing campaigns, really exploiting the fear that exists to date. We have to consider our security operations team, right? I mentioned before that our SOC is now decentralized, but what happens when your SOC doesn't have centralized insider visibility or current assessment of what's going on within their enterprise? Is your security operations team having the appropriate level of information to adequately protect, detect, and respond to adversarial threats? A lot of teams don't have centralized visibility. They've got on-premise solutions that require you to VPN into the corporate network. You may be traveling, you're not VPNing in, you've got access to the data you need access to. Are you even getting updates, or is your security operations team informed of the vulnerabilities that exist on these devices that are now remote, that may still have access to corporate data? And we also had this work from home shift honestly happened overnight. It happened very quickly. It wasn't something that we necessarily built up to and were planning for. A lot of industries, let's think of education, for example. Within the U.S., as the education sector was hit very heavily with this because they needed to shift how they deliver content almost overnight so that they could enable students to work remotely. And it led to a lot of different problems, right? The education industry in general is understaffed in a lot of and underfunded in security in general. So there's already issues that existed prior to this shift. But then they had to set this up overnight. There were a lot of identified misconfigurations, exposed vulnerabilities that weren't thought about when we were spinning out new infrastructure to essentially say, hey, we need to support this, do what you have to. We even saw very relaxed remote policy as well, where people were going in and giving out administrative privileges so that you could install what you needed to install. You were getting access to directories that you probably shouldn't have access to. And these are all things that are just changing around us so rapidly that we haven't been able to adapt. And adversaries never like to waste fear, essentially. You never waste a crisis when you're an adversary because you know that our guard is going to be down. And countries in general, this is a quote from the FBI here, is that people just have a hyper focus on this virus. We're overly concerned, as we should be, right? We're concerned with what's going on. So we are very susceptible to spear phishing attacks and general attacks by adversaries that maybe we would have been not as caught off guard on in previous months, but they're using fear to get to us. They do this online as well as in spear phishing campaigns, and we're just not prepared, right? And this is where I want to transition and just talk about security training to date. because this whole topic is about security as a team sport. So we understand the threat landscape today, right? We're decentralized, our security operation team is spreading out. There's different challenges that come as a part of this. But what I want to overlay this with is security training and understanding this. Because with security training, the reason that we have this the way that we do in corporate environments is because what is the weakest security link? If we were in person, you would all jump up and shout the answer, right? Now, what is the weakest security link in the organization? It is you. It is me. It is people in the organization, because people are susceptible to emotions. We are prone to mistakes, right? And this fear that we feel or are experiencing is certainly triggering adversaries. And this is not something that is new, right? You are the weakest security link. That is why we have security training. And security training, historically speaking, when you take these classes, there are some goofy videos about a bandit coming in and asking for personal information. And, you're talking about legitimate things that can happen, sometimes in a funny way, right? But it's giving you awareness around security in the context of an enterprise or in a corporate context. The problem that I have with this is not that it's not useful, right? Because this is absolutely useful information. There were things that I learned in security training that I wasn't previously aware of. I always go back to grandma and make sure that she's aware of the latest security training as well. But what's interesting is that they're only talking about it most of the time in the context of corporate security. But the question I have is that if we are now in this remote work environment, how does this security training relate to you outside of the corporate environment? Because security is not just security's job. It is your job, it is my job. Since we are the weakest link, we need to be vigilant. We need to be looking for adversaries. But when we talk about corporate training, it doesn't relate to me and how I can be more secure in my day-to-day life. My thought here, and the lead into this presentation, is how do we talk about security in a more personal way? So I'd like to generally ask these questions, so feel free to answer them silently to yourself or type into the chat. But I always like to ask in my presentations, how many of you have been taught how to secure your personal email, right? You're on Google, you're on Yahoo, you're on Hotmail. How do you secure your personal email account? How many of you have connected to a public Wi-Fi and completed different work tasks or completed some sensitive tasks on a public Wi-Fi without connecting over the VPN or using a secure connection? How many of you have changed your default passwords in your home office, right, on your router or your Wi-Fi? Default passwords are easily searchable online. You can look up manufacturers and you can actually find default passwords. So if people have not changed those default passwords, you're not going to be, or you could easily be taken advantage of here. So this is what I wanted to get to, right? We wanted to understand what is that teaching scenario here. Because if security is a team sport, we need to understand how security relates to us so that hopefully for your employees, this translates to thinking about security more frequently or more readily in their day-to-day life. So hopefully that increases your security of you, right? The protection of the people or reducing the attack or risk associated with people. So the example that I want to go through here in this training scenario is talking about Google security, right? I'm only using Google because it's something that people readily use. We are constantly on Chrome. We've got different browser extensions, but Chrome has this very handy dandy feature where you can save your passwords, you can link credit cards, you can tie everything together. And so if an adversary can take advantage of your Google account, that can be extremely problematic. So there's a couple different areas that I think that we should talk about with our users. So starting first with signing in to Google. One of the basic things that we should be doing in terms of security best practices is ensuring that we have two-factor authentication enabled. Why? Because if someone guesses that your pet's name is Bob and you used Bob as your password across the board, you need a secondary protection to say, no, that's not me typing in the password. Two-factor authentication is something that you can do outside of your corporate email account as well. That simply is a check that will go to your email or your phone number. You can use fingerprints, so you can use facial recognition. There's a lot of different checks to say, hey, are you truly who you say you are? So an account like Google, which has access to all of your data pretty much, go into the settings and actually attempt to set up two-factor authentication or two-step verification. Right? This is a practice that I went through in my own personal account as well, just to make sure that we had these different items set up, right? Set up two-factor authentication. I also recommend frequently changing your Google account PIN. This can be used for things like Google Wallet. Don't keep that the same, because then people can get access to payments and for money in that way. You know, constantly change or reassess. Maybe it's something that you're reassessing once every month, once every 6 months, but at a minimum, look at this once a year to change your default password, your PIN, but ensure two-factor authentication is set up. Another way that we can start engaging our employees in the context of Google is Google also reports on what devices are currently logged in under your account. Go in and run a check. Right? I actually had never checked this prior to building out this content, and I found it a very interesting exercise because I had some of my old devices that I had sold previously that were still active on some of my accounts. Through Google, you can actually force a logout. Make sure you can say, hey, I don't recognize this device. You can sign out of all of your accounts. You can also locate where that particular device is currently. So this is a great security practice. Understand who has access to your data, right? Sign out of old devices or report unrecognized devices to make sure you are secure in these different areas. The next area, or the last area that I want to talk about in terms of Google, right? We set up two-factor authentication, talked about things like changing passwords, PINs, making sure you know which devices are signed into your account. But we also want to consider using a password manager. Now, this is actually funny. I was having a conversation with a coworker not too long ago, and he had mentioned that with some of our parents or grandparents or people that are just not comfortable with computers, this becomes very hard for them to remember their passwords, right? If you have 100 different passwords, it's very challenging to remember all those different passwords. So for your savvy users, you should be using a password manager. There are plenty of password managers out there. LastPass is a great one that a lot of people recommend, but there are other free websites out there that allow you to do password managers. This is something that also has two-factor authentication set up. There's additional configuration in place to make sure that these are secure. But I do recommend looking at things like a password manager, because what Google does is it gives you a very simple pop-up prompt, and it says, hey, do you want to save this password? 9 times out of 10, I'm sure you're clicking yes, I do, because the next time you want to log in, you want it to be very easy, right? You want to click in and have that auto-populated. So in Google, you can actually go to Password Manager and look at all of the websites where you have default credentials still stored. So in this capacity, right, I had 39 different accounts that still had my credentials saved. You need to go in and reassess. Do you know what the websites are? Are these passwords the same across all 39 devices? Because that would be a risk as well. And with these, it's interesting because I even had I even identified some poor hygiene by some of my previous employers. I had some of my accounts still saved for my previous employers, and I was actually able to log into some of those accounts. So I did email them and notify them that my account was still active so that they could know to revoke that access. But it's something that's a little, it's scary, right? You could think, oh, this is an old password, it's not relevant. So even if someone compromised it, what happens if you're using that same password across the board? That's why it's important to use things like Password Manager so that you don't have to feel like you use the same password across the board. You can use something that, a tool to help you remember. And the point I was going to make about, your non-computer savvy users, to be in all honesty, this is typically a security no-no, but I'm going to say this for our non-computer savvy people. Have grandma write it down on a Post-it note. If it's on a Post-it note in her home, this is going to be much more secure than using the same password across the board, because in order to get to grandma's password, someone's going to have to get access to her house, find that Post-it note, and then know which accounts to log into, right? It's not the best practice, but from a non-savvy standpoint, it is something that can be used in certain situations. My general recommendation, however, is to use something like a password manager and go through the websites that you have your saved credentials in. Log out of those websites, delete those credentials, change your password if you recognize that you're using the same password across the board, because those are all things that adversaries can exploit. So just to recap, some of the key takeaways I hope that you get out of this session. Adjusting to the new normal, right? Recognize that there is a new normal. We have a work from home mandate, a lot of companies working from home indefinitely, but that poses some unique challenges from a security perspective. And we need to start thinking about how we can reimagine cybersecurity, because we can't just teach our users about cybersecurity in the context of the corporate environment if we no longer have corporate environments as our normal. We need to train people in the ways of how to personalize cybersecurity, and hopefully that Google walkthrough is just a snippet of many different ideas that you can do. Setting up your home router, securing your home networks. These are all great things that people can take home and start to generally improve their security hygiene, so that hopefully that reflects back to us in the future, or your organization in the future, so that we know, yes, you and I are the weakest links, but we need to work towards improving that. So thank you. For additional references, feel free to scan this QR code. We have our 2020 Cyber Outlook report. We do release these different reports to indicate different trends that we are seeing with adversaries. And with that, thank you, and we will take questions in the chat. Otherwise, I am more than happy to take questions over email. Find me on LinkedIn. But again, thank you so much for joining my session. Thank you again for joining my session around security as a team sport. My name is Sanara Marsh, and I hope you have a great rest of your conference.